California here. In the mid-'70s, I started in the National Security Agency, and that led me to a great career to ride this wave that we now call cybersecurity. But one of my earliest memories, in one of my first intern tours, I was stationed in a group called the Computer Security Design Guidance Division, which is a group of about 40 professionals, engineers, and computer scientists, working what was then known as computer security. And I remembered a group of what we now call graybeards, and they did have gray beards by and large, standing around the coffee pot, because that's what people did back then, and talking about life and pontificating about the business. And I remember distinctly one conversation that went something like this, and I say this with all respect to Paul and all the lawyers in our audience today. The quote was, when the lawyers get involved in this business, they're going to ruin everything. And, you know, I'm just a young intern right out of college. I'm thinking, hey, that sounds pretty wise, you know, because these are all technical wizards. And lawyers, oh, my gosh, they're not technical wizards like us. And, well, it took me a couple decades to get a little bit more wisdom and to become a graybeard myself. And I realized, you know, being a graybeard and thinking about this problem as a technical problem might be great job security, but it's not very good social policy, and it's not very good for making decisions about businesses and about economics. So this has really been, I think in the last few years, we're seeing a major shift in the way we perceive this business of cybersecurity, and I call it emergence from wizardry, right? We're moving from, you know, what's the best technical idea, who's the smartest technical person, to the role that our business now plays in economic and social decision-making. And so that the focus then becomes not on how do we achieve security perfection, but how do we do enough security, how do we make decisions, how do we operate businesses and run missions in governments and do it in a rational way that's really aware of the risks, right? We're not going to build perfect security. That hasn't happened in my career, and I don't think will happen in yours either. So, you know, if you ask a security wizard of the old guard, you know, how much security is enough? There's a standard answer, right? It's more. You know, you fix 20 vulnerabilities, okay, then here's 20 more, you know, and if you do all these things I told you to and fix all the results from the penetration testing, don't worry, I got more for them. So you have to really think about how do I make a rational decision about more, about how much is enough? And then even more challenging, how do I explain that decision to other parties, whether it be lawyers, judges, but also auditors, insurance companies, friends in the supply chain, and so forth. That's what's really starting to shift the business now, which is about not only making good security decisions, making a rational one, you know, aware of the implications for the business and for society around you, but how do I explain that decision to multiple parties over and over again? So that's a big part of what really drives the CIS controls, and I think you'll see them embodied today in the discussion about CIS RAM. So there's a few bullets up on the screen in front of you that are about thinking about risk. And, you know, I often say we're not in the cyber business, really. We're really in the risk business. And how do we translate what we know about technology, about attackers, about vulnerability, about threats, into the language of and into the terminology that allows people to make rational decisions. And as I said, we have to think about this world where lots and lots of people have to make important decisions about security, but they are not security professionals. They're just doing their part, you know, whether it's regulatory, whether it's supply chains, litigation, all these things are really important decisions that we need to make that we as security technologists really have to be prepared to support. So this is kind of the philosophy and thinking that helps us think about CIS RAM and the role that it plays in here. So what we've had the great opportunity to pull together some great minds to think about this problem and to sort of put together CIS RAM, which we think is be a big step forward in this translation into the technical understanding of threats and attacks and technology into decision-making specifically aimed at legal, aimed primarily at legal sort of decisions. Next slide up, please, Robin. And so overall goals for the CIS RAM methodology, thinking about this as a practical activity, right? This has to be within reach of both technologists but also decision makers. So it's not just a document, it's not just a list, it's a set of instructions which includes working aids, examples, and you know, this is right in the style of CIS. You know, let's all learn from each other. Let's take a first shot, take our best shot to create something that's valuable, use the community as both feedback mechanism, but also as the workforce that really improves the idea. So we can wait for forever for perfection. And again, I've got 42 years in this business now. I don't see perfection coming anytime really soon. So we really need to think about, let's take our best available shot at this. Let's put out not just a great document, but working aids. Let's collect examples of things that work and things that don't work. And let's see if we can really do something big here. It's also important for us to think about the nature of the CIS controls and how they get implemented. You know, I would love to tell you that I knew how to write the perfect security framework, security to-do list, et cetera, but, you know, I can't do it and no one else has either, as near as I can tell. And they're all over the map. The goal here is not that everyone takes a one-size-fits-all, but the CIS controls really represent a very wide variety of expert opinions brought together, look at the technical issues, but now we get to reality. Right? You have to deal with your enterprise, the risks that your company faces, the budget that you have, the people that you have. And our general philosophy around these things is, let's focus first on what we have in common, which is really the CIS controls and all the work that underpins it. And now let's look at your situation and help you adapt rationally, reasonably, even if you can't literally do everything and follow every word that's on there. So that's kind of the philosophy that you'll see embodied in CIS RAM. And of course, we're now entering a world of enterprises who don't deal with one framework, but they deal with all kinds of different regulatory issues, frameworks, requirement lists, and so forth, including risk assessment methodologies. And so we're very conscious of what I would call peaceful coexistence here at CIS. We're not trying to create yet another competitor. We're trying to create a way that people can navigate this complicated ecosystem of all these different conceptually folks that are looking over your shoulder. So with that as a backdrop, Robin, next slide up, please. I'm going to turn it over to Phil to talk a little bit about the controls and the role that they play with CIS RAM. Phil?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Tony. So for those who don't know, the CIS controls are actually built and supported by an immense community of cybersecurity experts that are willing and to donate their time to help develop this content. As part of that, when we approach the controls, we really want to provide a general assessment, a general cybersecurity recommendations that would help all organizations, in which case we're really looking at the common threats and then the common types of environments that organizations are employing. As part of that, they don't necessarily address all the unique risks an organization is facing. So this is where something like CIS RAM is extremely useful. It's going to help us kind of evaluate, not only your current deployment, but also understand, how does the controls, which are really kind of this generalized, community-based security recommendations, apply to your organizations and your risks. As we're growing with the community and as we're getting more volunteers involved, we're starting to look also at larger sectors and in terms of how do the controls apply to specific circumstances such as industrial control systems. But once again, these are kind of these large, broad stroke look at cybersecurity defenses. And something like CIS RAM is really intended to help organizations with how you understand how they can apply it within their own environment. You can go to the next slide. So CIS RAM really consists of 3 different documents. So you have the main CIS RAM document, which has a lot of really good information in terms of the process, the background, the logic, and then also some detailed instructions to really help you walk through. So we're not really throwing you out into the ocean with no lifeguard. We have at least a process to help you get started and to get you really going in terms of your risk management process. And additionally, we're also looking at different tiers of maturity to help organizations that have a very strong understanding of risk to organizations that are really kind of just starting their path. And we also have the CIS RAM Express, which is a shorter guide, which really looks at the core content of CIS RAM and how do you really just kind of get started, the 0 to 60 look. And then you have the workbooks, which provide the worksheets and the examples that are found within CIS RAM, so you can work alongside with the document and the workbook at the same time. And as we mentioned, there's 3 different levels of risk management capability that are really going to encompass, I think, the majority of organizations that are going to be looking at implementing the controls. So I'm excited to hand it back for Tony as we're going to get a little more detail to what CIS RAM is. Back to you, Tony.
Yep, thanks, Phil. Appreciate it. Good intro. And next, I'll turn it over to Paul, assuming he's not too offended by my lawyer joke to start the day. Paul's going to give us a perspective about the sort of philosophy from a legal perspective underlying CIS RAM. Paul, up to you.
Thanks, Tony, and I'm pleased that it was only one lawyer joke thus far this morning, so I'd say it's going well. I wanted to offer a brief legal perspective on why security risk management is so important and how the CIS RAM can help organizations really meet those legal requirements related to security and the various standards, regulations, and laws that have come into force. This is a conversation, to Tony's point, that is no longer left to the IT or information security folks within an organization. It's now a top-of-mind issue for boards, for senior management, and for the public at large. The unfortunate reality in the world we live in is that there are constant and increasing cyber threats and attacks, and organizations only have finite resources to manage security risk and yet face this ever-expanding and evolving risk landscape. Historically and frequently in this space, legal compliance has been viewed as a more check-the-box exercise or a gloss on those existing efforts undertaken by IT or information security. And here, CIS RAM is a real contribution to help organizations strike an appropriate and defensible balance that can meet that legal set of needs. What does that balancing act entail? Well, organizations have a need to secure their data, systems, and networks as much as they can to minimize potential impact to others. And organizations also want to align their security efforts with their objectives and mission, what the purpose of their organization is in the world. And they want to do so in a way that does protect those assets. And yet organizations must be mindful of the cost and complexity of various security measures that are being contemplated or implemented, the potential burdens associated with implementing certain safeguards that might be layered on top of an existing security program, and the potential trade-offs with other priorities and constraints that they face as an organization. And with all this, a methodology such as CIS RAM provides a means to meet these legal requirements in a way that creates a balancing act that manages these sometimes competing, often in tension, but not inherently opposite objectives and realities for an organization, and provide a way that should an organization's security program ever be challenged before a court of law or in a regulatory investigation, then an organization can define its approach to risk management in a meaningful way. Next slide, please. So in the regulatory landscape, cybersecurity has been an increasing focus over the years, and reasonable risk has emerged as the theme on which federal and state regulations in the U.S. and the approach increasingly abroad as well has been anchored. So what does this mean? Really starting at the federal level in the 90s, there was an executive order that defined cost-benefit analysis as a fundamental component of regulations going forward, and that was enshrined in numerous federal regulations regarding security following that executive order. The HIPAA security rule and GLBA safeguards rule are two prime examples that have encapsulated in the regulatory text this principle of organizations managing risk to an acceptable level and engaging in reasonable and appropriate risk assessment. Similarly, various states have followed the same approach. The Massachusetts Data Security Regulations and more recently the NYDFS Cybersecurity Regulation captured the same principle in defining the legal standard as organizations conducting a risk assessment and managing risk to an acceptable level. More recently, and taking effect in May of this year, the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, in the European Union has a security and risk analysis component instructing organizations to implement organizational and technical measures to reduce risk to an acceptable level. The same principle is really sweeping the globe as regulators struggle with a way to define what the expectations are for organizations. Next slide, please. Meanwhile, organizations often face questions following some sort of incident or event about how they manage risk reasonably. And so here, courts in the litigation context have wrestled with these issues for decades. More recently, in various cyber attacks and data breaches and associated litigation, courts are taking up the charge of the previous approach they took to this type of balancing act, and they're importing standard legal principles and applying them into this cybersecurity realm. What that means is that courts and litigants are looking to define what was the standard of care that an organization was held to. Did they meet their duty of care? And they're doing this weighing test of what were the burdens and benefits associated with certain measures. Was it reasonable for the organization to have implemented this safeguard but not that safeguard? Would that additional safeguard been reasonable at the time? And this is often an exercise in hindsight, but it's rooted in the principle of what is foreseeable or what was foreseeable at the time of the incident. Thus, against that backdrop, the CIS RAM provides a way for organizations to engage in that exercise proactively so that if their practices are ever questioned later, they've defined for themselves at the time, prior to an incident, prior to an event, how they took a reasonable and appropriate approach to the cybersecurity risks that they faced, how they made those weighing decisions, and they can submit that to the court, to regulators, and to others to set the bar for what was reasonable for them and provide a defensible methodology for defining that risk. With that, I'll turn it back over to Chris to describe further the specifics of the CIS RAM standard.
Great. Thank you all for joining. This is actually one of those really good pieces of news where if anyone looked at someone else cross-eyed, uh-oh, you're an attorney, or uh-oh, you're a technologist, or uh-oh, you're an executive, we actually found something really pretty interesting, and that's that we're all thinking the same way, really. So here's one of the things that surprises people as you talk through things. As Paul just walked us through, there's this balancing test that happens with attorneys. And then we also see something happening in regulations that's also the same type of thing. We need reasonable controls. And if you look at things like the safeguards rule and the new regs from New York's Department of Financial Services, you actually see that they're talking about reasonable security, and they want things to be determined by risk. And then you look at information security practices, ISO 27005, NIST 800-30, they're all saying the same thing. What the attorneys, the regulators, and the information security specialists are all saying is, look ahead at what could go wrong in your environment, given what you're doing for a living. What could go wrong? And let me know what and think through for yourselves what the likelihood and the impact of those things would be if they go wrong. And then when you think about safeguards to reduce those things, make sure that those safeguards are not more burdensome than the risk you're trying to protect. They're literally writing this into these regulations and literally discussing negligence like this in courts, and we're literally writing that into our information security standards in ISO 27005 and NIST 800-30. The challenge has been that when you look at NIST 800-30 and ISO 27005 and other security standards that have come out, you see that there's it's difficult for the reader, for us, to know what to do to analyze that risk and to demonstrate foreseeable threats and foreseeable harm. It's difficult for us to think about how to quantify or somehow compare a safeguard to the risk. This is a challenge. So the CIS RAM project had been focused on this idea of making this practical. So as Phil mentioned, there's the instructions, the CIS RAM, step by step, how do you do this? There are examples in this document, so you see how a fictional organization does this at the level of a novice and a fairly experienced or an expert organization. There are 3 different levels of analysis. And then an actual workbook that gives you templates. So that if you're following the directions and following the examples and following the exercises that are in CIS RAM, you're actually writing your risk assessment the way that CIS RAM is doing it, and in a way that the practitioners have seen function well in conversations with regulators and attorneys and sometimes judges after a breach occurs. So this has been a real goal. How do we make this practical? Now that we know that there's sort of a universal way to think about risk and reasonable and appropriate security, how do we create the practical instructions for setting up a risk assessment, and then looking at the CIS controls and knowing that we're evaluating them in a way that a regulator, a judge, a business person would understand? Because one thing we're neglecting here is how well this universally describes business. On the topic of business, let's take a look at this slide, the risk assessment criteria slide. Now, what's a very important root of risk analysis CIS RAM so that it makes sense to business and regulators and judges and attorneys in general is to be sure that we thought through in terms of a risk the foreseeability of something, but also the impact against us, the organization for sure, against others who are not us, who could be hurt, and against what we're here to do. There's a reason why we engage in business, why we engage in education, healthcare, et cetera. And some people engage in risk when they do that, when they join that business with us, right? So if you go to a hospital, I'm ill, I'm very gladly going to give you my PHI because there's this pain and you're going to make it go away. And if I don't give you that PHI, it's going to be hard for you to take care of that issue. We join in that risk, right? So the way that regulators will talk about this meaning of working together is mission, right? And judges will talk about this as the utility of the risk. What was the purpose of us engaging in the risk? So we're going to want to think about the impacts that we could or couldn't suffer against the mission. How about the objectives? This is what the organization's trying to do for themselves. You know, we want to grow at a certain rate. We want to be profitable. We want to we need to manage a certain level of certification so we can function in the organization and function in the world. And then our impact to obligations. You'll see this on the chart on the left. Mission, impact, mission, objectives, and obligations. We're going to think about impacts to all those areas. And you see that we've got a scoring of 1 through 5. This is just one of a couple ways that CIS RAM demonstrates doing this. Now, if we look at levels 1 and 2, and those are low scores, so we think mathematically, those are going to give us a low risk score once they enter math. And we think about 1 and 2 as acceptable levels of impact, where 1 is negligible and 2, it might be somewhat of a risk, but you could, or somewhat of an impact, but you could tolerate it. How would you define those against your mission, your objectives, and obligations? So the CIS RAM actually gives examples of an organization going through this process, walks you through their thinking and how they made these definitions and how they drew the line between what's acceptable and not acceptable in terms of impact. In fact, there are a lot of good instructions and examples, and then a template for working this out for your organization also provided in the set of documents. But then in Chapter 5, we actually go through a few more exercises to really work through, because this is one of the more novel and important concepts, but it's not natural and intuitive. So we actually spend some time on that. This is a very worthwhile thing to know. Then as you get to impacts 3, 4, and 5, these are unacceptable impacts you would have against your mission, objectives, and obligations. One of the key things here, as Paul was mentioning, balance becomes very important. So if we're talking about a 2, that will be acceptably low impact. It might be more than negligible, but it's acceptably low. You would want to be sure that anything you said that was acceptably low for your mission was also acceptably low for your objectives and obligations. That does a few things. One is, if you have a breach, you don't ever have to be embarrassed to explain why you were able to accept an impact for yourself, which is and for someone else equally. You're not going to say, look, Your Honor, I was going to spend up to $120,000 to prevent someone from losing an arm in the factory. Well, that's just an embarrassing thing to say, and it doesn't send the right message to your organization as you're thinking about risk. But you want to make sure that anything you've said that's acceptable to you is acceptable and equal to something that's acceptable to others. And that's one of the core principles here. As we go into foreseeability, we use a very plain, very simple to communicate language in terms of foreseeability. Whether something is in low scores not foreseeable or foreseeable, expected, common, or currently happening. This is the advice given in CIS RAM. We help people think through other ways to think about likelihood. If you're doing probability work, there are ways to tie a probability model results, say from a Monte Carlo result, into likelihood, so you're not locked in this way. This has flexibility, all right? But this is one of the real key concepts that we're trying to get people to think through. As you're thinking about risk, think about harm to yourself and others, what would be acceptable or not acceptable, and make sure that those are in balance, those are equal in terms of pain, all right? We can go on to the next slide. This next slide shows us something really important about acceptability, right? So when you see things like in the HIPAA security rule, reasonable and appropriate, when you see terms used acceptable, there's a way to define it now that you've sort of explicitly and concisely stated impacts to yourself and others that you could or couldn't accept. Now CIS RAM walks you through a process where you say, if I've been very careful to define a level of impact that I will not tolerate for my mission, the reason why we're here, I will not tolerate to my objectives, or I believe the public will not tolerate. If there's a definition for that that's equally stated across the board, I can say I will start to invest in risks that could foreseeably create that level of impact 3. All right? And then if I look over to foreseeability, and this is very variable. So some organizations might say, if we have an expected foreseeability of an unacceptable impact, that gives me a 3 of foreseeability times 3 of impact. Now, does it have to be 3 for foreseeability? No, not at all. So Haylock has been using this method for years with Hogan Lovells as well, and we've seen these numbers change. Some organizations they have very little tolerance for the amount of risk that they'll create, and some will actually say, I will not accept an impact of a 2, the way it's defined, and I will not accept it if it's foreseeable. And their line for acceptability is at 4, 2 times 2. So this doesn't have to be the way that everyone comes up with their acceptable level of risk. I mean, this shouldn't be the score for everybody. Just the example that we provide in CIS RAM. And again, we talk about how that number comes to be. You'll very likely not be doing this alone all by yourself. You'll be doing this with other people in the organization who can help you define impact and likelihood. But one of the key things here is when you go through the risk analysis, which we're about to show you, you can very quickly state why something will go above or below that line, whether you can accept that risk or not. And then if you can't accept a risk and the safeguard isn't working for you, how to find another safeguard that might work just as well. So let's jump onto the other slide and we'll start to get into the fun stuff. This is a squashed picture of a risk analysis. Again, in the CIS RAM document set, we give you the instructions, et cetera, and then we give you a workbook. In the workbook, you'll see different risk registers. Now, a risk register is simply a log of all the risks you've analyzed. And for every risk you've analyzed, you're also analyzing a safeguard on that same row to help you determine whether or not that safeguard and the risk are in balance. So this is an example of what a row would look like all squashed. But we encourage you to download that document so you can see the full length of this. This is in regard to CIS Control 1.1, utilizing an active discovery tool. And we've given shorter definitions of the controls here. But what we're going to do is say, look, the asset we're concerned about here, this would be for all devices, right? So this is an asset discovery tool. And the owner in this case would be the IT department in this fictional organization. Their vulnerability is, well, they've got a sporadic asset scan, so they know they're going to occasionally find new stuff. Is this risk enough? Is this good enough? And if not, what's the right safeguard? Well, this seems pretty simple, but we're going to walk through this simple example first. Their threat is they might have an undetected compromised system, right? And the risk scenario would be that irregular asset scans may not identify compromised systems that join the network and attack routable systems. So, okay, what if a dangerous system pops in, is vulnerable, and it's been attacked, or it is a threat in itself? We're not going to be able to detect those well. So then we're going to look at the mission impact, objectives impact, and obligations impact that look like the example we had before us. So we're not going to go back into that. We'll just remind you that 1 and 2 were acceptable impacts, and 3, 4, and 5 were unacceptable. This organization says our mission wouldn't be hurt by this too much, probably acceptably, but our objectives are going to be hurt pretty badly. We could recover from it. It would be a 4. 5, we might not recover from it. 4 would be bad. 4 from our obligations impact, a lot of people outside of us could be hurt. That's a 4. And then the likelihood, we think that's foreseeable. That's foreseeable and expected. It's not frequent. It's not current, but we think it's foreseeable. It's expected that something like this would happen, right? Very simple language again, right? We're not trying to bring in probability. We're not asking someone to make a distinction between a 2.5% and a 5% chance of something, which would be difficult to do without a really good probability model, right? So we're thinking about plain language ways of talking about this and then presenting mathematic counterpoints. So we've got our likelihood 3 times the highest impact, which happens to be 4, is a tie score, 3 times 4 is 12. 12 is higher than 9, which was the acceptable level of risk boundary. We would accept anything below 9 in the example we showed before. So 12 is higher than that. It's clearly not an acceptable scenario, right? Again, this is a simple example just to walk you through the math. We'll get through the more thorny issues in the next couple slides. So let's take a look at the treatment. Well, what if we implement the NAC and a system assessment process for alerted devices? That looks like, we can go back a slide again. I gave you a false alarm here. This is I forecast a bit. Could we back up a slide? Okay, thanks. So we're going to implement the NAC, again, using CIS Control 1.1. This is the way we're going to handle things. The organization said, given our environment, we think we could still have the same impact if we had that threat we were concerned about, but we think the likelihood now is it's foreseeable, but it's not expected that we would have an infected system enter undetected. It would have to be configured to be very stealth if that was going to work in that scenario. They think it's foreseeable that such a thing would happen. I don't expect it to happen. So their likelihood of 2 multiplied by their objectives and obligations impact, those are the higher of the 3 impacts. 2 times 4 is 8. Remember, 8 was below the acceptable level of risk 9. So they can accept that risk the way they defined risk acceptance criteria, all right? So this is a simple example for a simple problem. Let's go on to the next slide. And in this scenario, what we see is a look at Control 8.1. So this is one of those really interesting scenarios. What if the control is just not available to you in your environment? We've seen this in certain situations. I've been an admirer of the CIS controls back when they were the consensus audit guidelines with the SANS Institute, and will always praise their practicality. But I also know that in the many organizations that I've seen, some of the recommended controls just will not function in some organizations. This is a scenario that's provided in the CIS RAM, and we see more of the detail about how an organization deals with this thorny issue. We know we should be able to put centrally managed anti-malware software on systems in our network. And occasionally we come across devices that will not allow us to modify the software. In this case, the scenario is something called a diary device controller, and that's provided by a vendor, and the vendor says, thou shalt not change any of the software or processes on this system, or it's no longer supported, right? We've seen situations like this in the field. I'm sure everyone on the call has seen something like this, where they're just not allowed to do the right thing. In this case, we're concerned about malware attack. That's the threat. The risk scenario, vendor does not allow added software to be installed on the controllers. They have Samba and SSH running on the controllers, and that might allow malware infection, right? Putting the malware on, running a command. The mission impact in this case would be 3. That's intolerably high for them. Their objectives impact would be 4, and their obligations impact would be 3. So in the case of the scenario, there are not many patient records on this device that could be attacked. So that's a 3. Again, the highest impact is 4. The likelihood foreseeable and expected to occur is 3. 3 times 4 is 12, so it's not an acceptable risk. So now when a vendor says, but this is the limitation to our software, I'm sorry. Well, I've got an unacceptable risk here. I've documented this as unacceptable. I know I can't accept this. It doesn't mean that I'm frozen. If this is the one vendor that creates this product, I might be stuck with this scenario, but what if I can modify a couple things about their current deployment of the software they've got on there? What if we use a different control from CIS, in this case 12.11, that requires soft-cert-based SSH authentication? Well, in this case we have multi-factor authentication. Well, let's actually use 12.11 to take care of our inability to implement 8.1 in this one tool. And what if we require soft-cert-based SSH and then daily re-image the OS? So if someone does put a bad malware file on there, we can refresh it, but it would be hard for anyone to actually initiate anything with that software because they would actually need a soft cert to use SSH and run that command. What would that scenario look like in terms of risk? And they run now, and they, through their reasoning that we show you in CIS RAM, now they come down to where the likelihood is not foreseeable that you could actually have an impact from this kind of attack because of lack of malware on this specific machine. So 4, the impact for the objectives is still the same, times 1, the likelihood is 4. That's acceptably low. So if someone says, is there another scenario for us to do, for us to protect the system, you could say, let me look at the other controls and let me see if I can find something that addresses the limitation that we've got technically, but that still uses a good practice that CIS controls present us, and apply it to see if that's acceptable. Well, acceptable in what terms? On the terms that we defined up front, our mission, our objectives, and our obligations to others. So this is one of those really important balancing tests. We're going to be able to jump ahead on one more slide. I'm going to address this one quickly so we can get to some questions. This is a scenario where someone comes up with a safeguard that's equally bad as the risk. So in this case, again, very quickly, there's an enterprise application farm. It's very difficult to patch. The concern is that, and I know everyone on this call has seen this, there are risk scenarios that we have to be able to deal with here. In this case, OS and framework level patches hard to deploy. Hackers can attack known identifiable vulnerabilities. And very quickly, using the same criteria we discussed, they say, boy, likelihood and impact, there's a 16 right there. Of course, that's not only unacceptable, that's high. So someone says, well, what if we implement IPS in that environment using 12.7? Well, okay, but our concern is that the code is so kludgy that our normal operations of the application look like an attack, because we're doing things like passing SQL through GET. We're doing all sorts of things that will look like a SQL injection or cross-site. This is what the application developers have done to make this kludgy application work. That's going to break our use of the application. So you see that you can hurt your mission and objectives by applying a safeguard that's just going to break stuff. So let's go on one more slide. If we have a control that creates as much of a problem as the risk, we can hunt around and look for other controls. In this case, we took 2 of them, 18.1 for a web app firewall. Okay, so you've got a kludgy application, but let's actually see what we can do on the front end to prevent some of the classic things that we know we can deal with, and see if we can shut down some rules that look like the attack, that are appropriate code but look like an attack. And then let's implement IDS, intrusion detection, so we don't shut down valid issues. One thing that we've seen work very interestingly is if you have IDS running in a kludgy environment, you can find all those things that alert as a problem and put that into your corrective action plan to address in your code, to clean up your code so your code doesn't look like an attack anymore. We've seen this happen. So in this case, the organization says, let's do 18.1 and 12.6 first to give ourselves a protective shell, go into alert mode, and once we clean up the code based on what we learned from IDS alerts, then we'll go back to control 3.4 to deploy automated operating. But let's clean up our environment first. Does this look like appropriate risk? It sure calculates as that, because we bring down our potential impact to our mission, our obligations, and our objectives, and the likelihood of those go down as well. The likelihood remains the same, but now we've got the lower objective or lower impacts. So we're running through this pretty quickly. I know one of the questions that one of the things we're interested in doing is setting up a workbench. We're going to discuss that in a moment, where we can actually demonstrate this more thoroughly in a workshop environment. So what we wanted to be sure that in this session you at least got a good sense of what it is that the CIS RAM is showing, how it addresses those things that Paul was talking about in terms of balance in legal and regulatory areas. So let's move on then, on to our next portion.
Super. Thanks very much, Chris. Appreciate the exposition there. And I know people can really identify with examples 2 and 3. And that's real life. It tells you how hard it is to write security guidance that covers all cases, but also tells you that, there's, in any given situation, there's a discussion of trade-offs. And what we're really focused on here is not the perfect answer, but the how do I intelligently look at these trade-off issues, and is the cure worse than the problem I'm trying to solve? So those are all real-life issues as we look at them here. So you see in front of you CIS RAM joining the community. And what makes the CIS controls, the CIS benchmarks, all our products worth your time is your time. That is, these are built by volunteers, with great ideas, some of the most amazing minds in the industry from all around the world, every sector of the economy contributing. So you can be a part of this and you can join our communities. What we've created is an online community of sort of self-help, right? If you have a problem, someone else has that same problem. If you're looking for a solution, someone's got it. We just have to find a way to hook you all together. So this is really the power of what goes on here with CIS. So we have a few questions in, and I'd like to kind of run them through the audience, through our panelists if we could real quick. And next slide, please. If you have questions online, please don't hesitate to send them in. We may not get to them all here, but don't hesitate. You can also reach us at CIS. There'll be contact information later, and we're happy to continue. Again, this is a discussion and really an exciting new activity from CIS, but we evolve all of these, right? There's no perfect answers to this. It's better to just, let's take our best shot and go into the next stage. Chris, since you finished up here, we had one question I think was particularly applicable here from Apollonia in the audience. It looks like your risk score calculations are based upon multiplying ordinal scales, not a mathematically sound practice. Can you speak to why you're doing this?
Mathematically sound. Yeah, so yeah. There's definitely a trade-off here. So sure. Yeah, we are definitely using ordinal scales, very simple. And if those of you on the call are interested in probability and using probability methods for risk analysis, we're in full agreement. The challenge is, how do you bring probability into a conversation in which you've got many different audiences, each who are prepared to talk about ordinal level risk analysis? So when you do look at how regulators and attorneys and information security folks, again, going back to things like NIST 800-30 and ISO 27005 and Risk IT from ISACA, when you look at how prepared everyone is to talk uniformly about probability, we're further from that than we are from the ability for people to use plain language conversations about the likelihood of certain impacts and the balance of harm and safeguard. This is not to say probability is wrong. In fact, HALOC works with one of the leaders in the field. You might be aware of Doug Hubbard from Hubbard Decision Research. And what we're doing on the back end, and we would welcome his team to actually join a community of CIS RAM sponsored by CIS, and we'll get into that, to help us map probability results into these likelihood and impact results. They are compatible, and we take steps together to make that work. We're focusing first on that practical translation first, but you're exactly right.
Yeah, Chris, that's fair. And I've been looking at and talking to, for example, leading actuaries who've been struggling with this problem in cybersecurity for at least a dozen years. We just don't have today the body of data, the evidence that would allow us to make the same kind of decision, or make decisions the same kind of way we sort of expect in terms of things like life insurance and homeowners insurance to rebuild homes after a hurricane. But what I really like about the approach here in CIS-RAM is we have a decision structure, and you pointed it out in your description, which where we have data, we can plug it in without sort of throwing away the framework. And as we mature in our thinking about these, or we have sources, or we have some insight, for example, into frequency or probability, we can make use of that. But we rather than wait for perfection, let's build the decision framework first. And as we mature, I think that will be a natural part of this.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, Paul, we had a question come in about, I'll say, insurance policies. Have insurance policies caught up with regulations and the impacts versus general liability coverage? Can you speak a little bit to the sort of notion of liability as it applies to both the thinking of insurance as well as the regulatory?
Certainly. So the cyber insurance marketplace is still evolving and settling. Unlike a lot of other insurance areas, there's not the same large volume of historical data to really inform those policies. But the trends we're seeing are definitely toward increased scrutiny in the insurance coverage process and establishing initial insurance as well as renewals, and a lot more questions and back and forth regarding the scope of coverage, the understanding of how organizations actually are managing risk, and looking for these kinds of artifacts to show that organizations are thinking about risk in a thoughtful way. That's still coupled from the insurance market with a lot of very particular, what you might say, line items where, for example, we see increasing requests for information about has the organization implemented X control, and if not, we need a very detailed explanation why not, and that might impact the extent of the policy or the premiums or something else. That being said, what the corresponding trend we're seeing is organizations seeking cyber liability coverage to provide evidence of their risk assessments to bolster their decisions around why didn't they implement, for example, multi-factor across all the environment, every system, and how they made a reasonable determination of, given the trade-offs and given this type of process, how they evaluated that they were implemented in these contexts but not in certain others, and they have a basis in an empirical and then really grounded approach, I should say, for reaching that determination. That is proving to be a useful part of the dialogue with insurers. It's still very much an evolving space, though, and it'll be interesting to see how it continues to evolve over time.
Yep, excellent, Paul. I think that's very consistent with what I've seen, too. Let me direct one to Phil here. And I really love Chris's example, the third example of this trade-off decision, right? I can't do, it doesn't make sense in this context to do exactly what the CIS controls specify. So I take an alternate look at that. It seems to me that to do that generally, we who work with the CIS controls need to be pretty open and explicit about what problem are we trying to solve with this control. Is there like a table of threats or vulnerabilities that we can align with the controls currently, Phil? And how do you see us making those kind of choices?
Sure thing, Tony. So in terms of the generalized look at the threats, we've worked on a project called the Community Attack Model, which looked at the specific steps an attacker does to achieve their objectives, much like the Lockheed Martin kill chain, and look at the different controls and different tools that will help mitigate their process, if you will. So that's one way we can look at the threats. We're also working closely with Verizon as well as MITRE and their attack model to better understand the connection and conjunctions between these very tactical attacker methodologies and these larger strategic trends and how the controls and specific security best practice tie into that. So right now we're really kind of in the starting stages of looking at this more in depth, and there's going to be hopefully more information and more value that we can provide in terms of making these connections and making it easier for organizations to really understand what is this trade-off between this control and what is the ultimate objective and how is it being achieved and how can it be supplemented through other means. So we're really kind of in the starting process of this.
Right. Thanks, Phil. Appreciate it. Yeah, and for the audience, we don't just dream the controls up whole cloth. I mean, there's an ongoing discussion with all the major threat intelligence companies and the kind of aggregators and the producers of annual reports and so forth. But part of this trade-off analysis is making sure that we're doing our best to map from the problem you're trying to solve to the potential controls, and then that allows you a more intelligent and defensible way to make these trade-offs here. Chris, I think this maybe addresses, this idea of foreseeable, is a challenging one to get a handle on here. And while something may be foreseeable in the sense of you should have known because you read the Verizon report, well, there's 100 of those things out there. So it seems to me for any one enterprise, foreseeable might not be reasonable. Can you kind of address that in the context of CIS RAM?
Yeah, and this is actually playing out in the state of Pennsylvania now at their Supreme Court. There's a lawsuit between employees of the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center and the medical center who had a breach, and the medical center is saying this breach was not foreseeable, and then given the utility of us being your boss, we need this, and what else could we do? So there's a state-level Supreme Court now haggling with this very issue. But what we mention in the CIS RAM is it is important, if you're doing a risk assessment, to have some kind of subject matter expertise involved in that risk analysis with you. And by the way, that would be the case with any kind of risk analysis that you're doing inside an industry. We're building bridges. Okay, have you thought about the risk, and do you have an expert engineer to help you with that? You wouldn't just do it yourself without that expertise. Hopefully the experts are bringing with them things like Verizon reports, actual analysis of breaches in a specific field or industry to help you think through how likely something is. But we do say it's important to actually rely on some of those things. We had some people reach out from the community saying, boy, I sure would like to develop a corresponding list of threats for the CIS RAM, which would be a great activity to do in the, if we were to develop, well, as we're developing communities with CIS and setting up a workbench specifically for CIS RAM. But it's something that the community could definitely develop, so it's easier to communicate amongst ourselves.
All right, Chris, challenge accepted. We'll take that on from CIS. And, for the audience, again, we are the community. So what you see as needs, I saw, for example, there's a question in the box here about mapping to the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is a hot question on everyone's mind. Believe me, we are fully committed at CIS to alignment with the NIST CSF, joint products, synchronizing, we're working with them on mappings and so forth. But any needs that you see to help you implement things, let us know at CIS. And even better, if you show up and you're willing to work, we'll put you to work and we'll team you up with other experts and we'll figure some of these things out here. There's a number of questions. We won't even get close to, we've had a flood of these questions come in, so we'll do our best to answer another one or two. But again, don't hesitate, reach out to us. There's email contact information for CIS. If we have enough questions, we'll put together kind of an answer with the panelists here and make them available to attendees in another means. A couple of questions were along the idea of when you sort of think about this issue of how much is enough, and Chris, I'll ask you to jump on this, how do we use that in terms of justifying budgets for what we know would be an efficient and effective countermeasure or control to add, and use that as a part of that discussion to rationalize the purchasing so that we can solve these problems? How would you see that happening, or how have you seen it happening?
Yeah, that's been really great. As you look at the CIS RAM documents and the workbook, you're going to see again models for things like the risk register. And once you finish a risk register, I've looked at all of my assets and the appropriate CIS controls, such through the risks, and you've laid all that out. You're going to have a list of risk treatment plans, and you're going to be able to sort those plans that address your highest risks first. But keep in mind, like we saw, the safeguards are measured with risks the same way the risk is. And you're going to be able to very quickly justify the reason why I'm asking for this, say, DLP system here is because it creates this much of an impact to the organization, but it prevents that much. It's going to cost this much. We can invest this much against that level of risk. We've seen this conversation work extremely well with CFOs, with anyone managing a budget, and certainly up to the executive level, because you're saying this investment prevents this much risk. It becomes a no-brainer conversation because it's a business conversation now, not an explanation about what regular expressions are and how they contribute to DLP. That's the harder question, right?
Oh, well, we love those endless discussions, Chris. We're running out of time here. Let me throw one more question, Paul, if you would jump on this one here, because it's a really important one. For organizations that are subject to multiple control frameworks and regulations, how do you make sure that this assessment deals with all of them? Is there any value in working at this in terms of navigating these multiple folks looking over your shoulder?
That really is an excellent question, and one of the core challenges that CIS RAM is trying to help organizations address. And the reality is that if an organization determines that there's 12 different regulatory requirements and schemes that are applicable and another 3 to 5 security standards that they'd like to leverage or align their program with, the idea of doing 15 plus separate assessments against each of those standards and frameworks and regulatory requirements quickly becomes untenable. So this type of methodology and leveraging a common set of controls that is consistent with and aligned with a variety of legal and industry standard and industry leading requirements and standards helps an organization systematically work through cybersecurity risk. There'll still be challenges at the margins, and there may be times in which under a specific regulatory framework there's additional a delta left over, so to speak, that needs to be addressed, and maybe a few particulars of a given regulatory regime that just require additional documentation or review. But by and large, this type of approach is designed to and really sets out a good framework and approach to addressing this holistically and really viewing across the board, taking into account these various standards and regulations.
Yeah, Paul, I think that's just becoming a way of life here. And our experience, especially we deal with lots of small and medium-sized enterprises, people are just overwhelmed with this problem of, how do I demonstrate to other parties that I've done the right thing? And I think that implies a commitment by all of us who create things like frameworks, like the CIS controls, et cetera. It really is our responsibility to make this easier to deal with. Otherwise, we're just going to crush the economy here with everyone trying to deal with this. So I'm going to wrap up a panel excellent. There's lots more great questions. We'll find some way to get some more answers out to you folks. And again, don't hesitate to reach out to us at CIS. Robin, can I turn this back over to you?
Absolutely, Tony. Thank you all very much. Thank you for your interest in the CIS controls and participation in our webinar today. You guys provided a lot of great questions for us, and we will follow up with responses for those that we were unable to answer during this webinar. A special thank you to you, Tony, Phil, Paul, and Chris for participating in our discussion today. As a nonprofit driven by its volunteers, we're always in the process of looking for new topics and assistance in creating cybersecurity guidance. If you're interested in volunteering and or have questions, comments, or have identified ways to improve this guide, for CIS RAM or any of our other guides, please feel free to write us at controlsinfo@cissecurity.org. This webinar has been recorded and will be available on our website very soon. We hope to have you back again for our next CIS webinar. Have a great day, everyone. Tony, not Paul.